In all his years of television, Steve Harvey had never felt a room change like this. The laughter that usually filled the Family Feud stage had quieted into something else. Not silence, exactly, but reverence. The kind that rises only when hearts begin to recognize one another. He stood at the podium, cards in hand, the glow of the studio lights softening against his face. It had started like every other show. Two families, a crowd ready for laughter, and the rhythm of friendly competition that always brought joy. But within minutes, it became something far greater. Something that would stay with him long after the cameras stopped rolling. It began with a family that didn't seem any different from the rest. 5 faces, each carrying a story the audience hadn't yet heard. The Collins family. Their smiles were bright, their laughter easy, but there was something about them that made Steve look twice. Maybe it was the way they stood close to each other, shoulders nearly touching. Maybe it was the way the youngest daughter, a teenager named Grace, kept glancing at her father with a quiet pride that felt bigger than words. When Steve welcomed them, the father, a tall man in his late 40s named Michael, stepped forward first. "Mr. Harvey," he said, his voice steady but humble. "It's an honor to meet you, sir. Our family has been waiting for this moment for a long time." Steve grinned, chuckling softly. "Oh, come on now, man. Y'all making me sound like a graduation speech. What's so special about this moment?" Michael looked down for a second, then smiled. "Because you don't know it yet," he said quietly. "But you've already been part of our family for years." The crowd laughed lightly, thinking it was a joke. But Steve caught the tone in his voice, gentle, sincere, touched by something deeper. He tilted his head. "Now, what you mean by that?" Michael glanced at his wife, Angela, standing beside him. She gave a small nod, her eyes glistening under the studio lights. "We used to watch you every night," she said, her voice warm but trembling slightly. "Every night, when times were rough. Your show was the one thing that still made our house feel normal." Steve's smile softened. "Well, that's what we try to do," he said. "Bring a little laughter to folks who need it." Angela shook her head gently. "No, Mr. Harvey. You didn't just make us laugh. You got us through." For a heartbeat, the room seemed to pause. The words hung in the air, heavy but graceful, like the moment before a storm breaks. Steve blinked, his hand still resting on the cue cards, unread. "Got you through what?" he asked, his voice lowering. Angela looked to her husband again. He took a deep breath, his jaw tightening just slightly before he spoke. "Our son, Matthew," he said quietly. "He passed away 6 years ago. He was 15. A hush swept through the audience. The laughter, the cameras, the game. All of it faded into the background. Steve's eyes dropped for a moment, his hand instinctively resting against his chest. I'm so sorry," he said softly. Michael nodded. "It's okay. We're not here for pity. We're here because we thought it was time to thank you." Steve looked back up, his expression searching. "To thank me?" Angela's eyes shimmered. "Yes, sir. Because the night before we lost him, Matthew was watching you. You were telling a story about your mama, about how she believed in you when no one else did. And when it ended, he turned to us and said..." Her voice broke. She pressed a hand to her mouth, the words trembling through her tears. "He said, 'If Mr. Harvey can make it through all that, I can too.'" Steve froze. The crowd, hundreds of strangers, sat in utter stillness. The air in the studio changed again. The warmth of the lights seemed softer now, golden and weightless. Michael continued, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "That was the last thing our boy said to us before the accident. And in the years since, every time we felt like falling apart, we'd turn on your show. It reminded us of him, of hope, of laughter we thought we'd never find again." Steve looked down, blinking rapidly, his throat tightening. His cue cards slipped slightly in his hand. He set them down on the podium, one slow movement at a time. When he finally looked back up, his voice had changed, quieter, rawer, trembling at the edges. "You mean to tell me, all this time, y'all been carrying that?" Angela nodded. "Every day. You didn't know it, but you helped us breathe again." The camera caught the look on Steve's face. Then not the entertainer's grin, not the confident host, but something else. A man standing at the intersection of heartbreak and gratitude. The kind of moment that strips away everything but truth. He stepped closer to them, his voice barely a whisper now. "You don't know what that means to me." And for the first time that afternoon, his voice trembled. Not from nerves, not from exhaustion, but from a love too deep for words, the kind that reminds a man that what he does, even on a stage meant for laughter, can still touch eternity. For a long, suspended moment, Steve just stood there silent, still, his eyes fixed on the family before him. The cue cards on the podium lay forgotten, the rhythm of the show broken in the most beautiful way. Behind him, the bright LED board that usually pulsed with questions and numbers faded quietly to its neutral blue glow, as if even the lights had decided to stop and listen. Angela's tears shimmered under the studio glow, but her expression wasn't grief anymore. It was gratitude, deep, raw, quiet gratitude that carried 6 years of memories folded inside it. Her husband, Michael, kept a steady hand on her back, grounding her, as though reminding her it was okay to speak truth in a place meant for laughter. Steve took a slow step closer, lowering his microphone. "You know," he said, voice trembling just slightly, "I tell folks all the time, you never know who's watching you. You never know what somebody's going through when they turn that TV on." The audience sat frozen, hundreds of eyes glistening, breaths held. You could hear a pin drop in that room. He looked at Grace, the daughter 16 now, long brown hair falling over her shoulders, holding her mother's hand so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "And what about you, sweetheart?" Steve asked softly. "You remember your brother?" She nodded, her voice small but steady. "Every day. He was my best friend." She paused, swallowing hard. "When he died, I didn't talk for months. I couldn't. But my dad kept turning on your show. He said Matthew would want us to laugh again. So we did, little by little, and it helped." Her words were simple, but the honesty in them carried more power than any script ever could. Steve blinked rapidly, his lower lip trembling. "Baby girl," he said, "you got no idea how much that means to me. You just reminded me what this work really is." He turned back to the audience, his voice breaking softly. "This, right here," he said, motioning toward the family. "This is why you gotta treat every moment like it matters. Every word, every smile. You don't know who's holding on to it." The crowd erupted into gentle applause, not the kind that comes after a joke or a win, but that soft, reverent kind that belongs in church. A woman in the front row dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Even one of the camera operators quietly wiped his cheek behind the lens. Steve took a breath and faced the Collins family again. "You said you've been watching me all these years, but what you don't know..." He stopped mid-sentence, pressing his hand against his chest. "What you don't know is, y'all just gave me something I didn't even realize I'd lost." Michael frowned slightly, puzzled. "What's that?" Steve's voice came out rougher now, lower. "Purpose. The kind that goes deeper than jokes and ratings. I've been doing this show a long time. Some days I walk out here and I think, man, is it still making a difference? But then you come here, and you tell me about your son, a boy I never met, and how something I said kept him going that night." He stopped again, shaking his head slowly. "That'll stay with me for the rest of my life." Angela pressed her hands together near her chest, whispering, "He'd be so happy to hear that." The lights glowed warmer now, like sunlight breaking through clouds. The whole set seemed smaller, more intimate. No longer a stage, but a living room, a sanctuary, a meeting place between grief and grace. Steve took another step forward. "You got a picture of him?" he asked gently. Michael nodded, pulling out a small photo from his wallet worn, creased from years of being carried. He held it out. In it, a smiling 15-year-old boy stood in a school uniform, his grin wide, his eyes bright with that unshakable energy that belongs only to youth. Steve took the photo carefully, holding it with both hands as if it were sacred. He stared at it for a long time before whispering, "That's a good boy right there." Angela's voice wavered. "He had your laugh, Mr. Harvey." The words hit him like a wave. He closed his eyes, his lips parting just slightly, as if trying to keep control of something deeper than tears. When he opened them again, they shone wet under the lights. "You don't know what that does to me," he said softly. The audience sat completely still, nobody clapping, nobody moving, everyone suspended inside the quiet heartbeat of that moment. Finally, Steve looked up from the photo and smiled through his tears. "You said he promised to keep laughing, right?" Angela nodded. He did. Steve took a deep breath and turned toward the crowd. Then that's what we gon' do today. We gon' laugh for him. The audience broke into applause, soft, emotional, but full of love. The Collins family joined in, smiling through their tears. Steve looked at them one last time and said quietly, "And I promise you this, I'm keeping that boy's laugh alive every time I walk out on this stage." As the camera pulled back, capturing Steve standing beside the Collins family under the golden lights, it wasn't a game show anymore. It was a communion between strangers, who suddenly weren't strangers at all. The applause lingered longer than usual, a living, breathing thing that filled every corner of the room. It wasn't loud, not wild or roaring, but tender, sustained, as if everyone wanted to hold the moment just a little longer before it slipped away. Steve turned slightly, facing the audience, his hand pressed against his chest, steadying the tremor in his voice. "Let me tell y'all something," he began softly. "You never know who you're gonna touch, or who's gonna touch you." He glanced back at the Collins family. "I thought I was the one giving joy out here. Turns out, God was sending some right back to me through them." The camera zoomed in slowly. His expression had changed. It wasn't performance now. It was a man stripped of titles and stage polish, standing bare in gratitude. "See, people look at TV and think it's all jokes and games," he continued. "But what we really do, is try to remind folks that hope still lives here." Angela wiped her eyes, nodding. "And you do," she whispered. "You did for us." Steve smiled gently, shaking his head. "Nah, Miss Angela, you did that for me." He looked down at the photo again, that boy's smile, frozen in time but radiating warmth even from a piece of paper. "You know," he said quietly, "when I look at this young man, I see somebody who got it. Somebody who understood life faster than most of us do. 'Cause if he saw something in me that made him believe he could make it, then he already had what it takes to change the world." Michael's eyes glistened. That's exactly who he was. Steve handed the photo back, careful not to smudge it, his hands trembling ever so slightly. Then he turned toward the audience, voice deeper now, not the booming charisma of a host, but the soft cadence of a man who knows how to speak to a soul. "I've been blessed to stand on a lot of stages. I've met presidents, stars, all kind of people. But today I met somebody's purpose, and I don't think I'll ever forget it." The crowd began to clap again, a slow rhythm that built and built until it became something close to a heartbeat. Steve looked at the camera, eyes still wet. "To the Collins family and to every family that's ever lost somebody they love, let me tell you something. They don't leave. Not really. They find ways to stay. Sometimes it's a song, sometimes it's a laugh, sometimes it's just a feeling that shows up right when you need it. That's them. That's how they come back to us." Angela's hand went to her chest as she nodded, whispering, "Yes, Lord." And then, almost as if the universe wanted to underline his words, something quiet and extraordinary happened. A low, faint sound echoed across the studio, the hum of the lights flickering briefly, followed by the gentle creak of a camera crane settling into place. But what people would talk about later wasn't the noise. It was the moment that followed. The massive digital screen behind the stage, the one that usually flashed questions and answers, suddenly glowed to life. It wasn't supposed to. The show had paused filming. The tech crew, just as surprised, froze as the screen illuminated an image, a still frame taken from earlier footage. It was the shot of the Collins family smiling together, their hands intertwined at the podium. And behind them, captured perfectly in the background, was the faint reflection of the photo Steve had held the boy's smiling face. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Angela turned, her hand flying to her mouth. Steve looked up at the image, his throat tightening. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The silence was reverent, fragile. And then, from the audience, a woman's voice trembled through the air. "That's him saying thank you." Angela began to cry, leaning into her husband's shoulder. Grace wrapped her arms around them both. Steve exhaled shakily, closing his eyes. "You right," he said softly. "That's him." He raised his head, eyes glistening under the stage lights. "You see, y'all, love don't need no permission to show up. It finds its way." The audience clapped again, though some couldn't stop their tears long enough to do it. Even the crew, the people used to the chaos and rhythm of taping, stood motionless, caught in the sacred stillness of what they'd just witnessed. Steve turned back to the family. "When you came here today," he said, "you thought you was thanking me, but what you really did was remind all of us what faith looks like in the dark. That's something this world needs to see." Angela nodded through her tears. "That's what Matthew would have wanted." Steve smiled softly. "Then we gon' keep his light going. Every time someone watches this, they gon' see him. They gon' see you. And they gon' remember that love, real love, never stops." The lights softened once more. The studio, so often filled with laughter and sound, stood in a rare, beautiful hush. Steve reached out, holding Angela's hand in one and Grace's in the other. "Y'all gave me something today," he said quietly. "You reminded me that what I do here, it ain't about TV. It's about connection, about hearts." And as the camera slowly zoomed out, the shot captured them standing together beneath the golden Family Feud logo. Not as host and guests, but as family bound by something invisible, something eternal. The moment was unscripted, pure, sacred, and it would be replayed, remembered, and whispered about long after that day, not because it made people laugh, but because it made them feel. After the show wrapped, the studio emptied slowly, not with the usual chatter and excitement, but with quiet awe. Even the production crew, seasoned veterans of live television, moved like they were walking through something holy. The soundstage felt softer somehow, the hum of the lights muted, as though the space itself was still holding its breath. Steve stayed behind. He always lingered after emotional moments, but this time, he didn't move for a long while. The audience had left, the families were gone, and yet, he remained on that stage, staring at the spot where the Collins family had stood. His cue cards were still scattered across the podium, and on top of them sat a single folded note, a thank you card Angela had slipped into his hand before leaving. He opened it slowly. The handwriting was neat, steady. "Mr. Harvey, you gave us back something we thought we'd lost. For years our home was quiet, the kind of quiet that hurts. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, our laughter felt alive again. Thank you for reminding us that love doesn't leave, it just changes rooms. With all our hearts, the Collins family." Steve pressed the note to his chest, his eyes glistening under the warm glow of the set lights. He looked up toward the rafters and exhaled. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, his voice trembling, "for letting me see this." A knock came at the stage door, his floor manager. "You okay, Steve?" He smiled faintly without turning around. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Just taking it in. You don't rush a moment like this." He walked to the edge of the stage, his shoes echoing softly against the floor. The massive screen behind him, the one that had glowed with the image of the boy, was dark now, but he could still see it in his mind. That smile, that light, that feeling. When he finally made his way back to his dressing room, the hallway was empty. The laughter and chatter that usually followed a taping were gone, replaced by stillness. On his desk sat a small brown envelope, no label, no name. Just a simple note taped to it. "For Mr. Harvey." He opened it carefully. Inside was a printed photo, a still frame from the broadcast. It was the exact moment when he and the Collins family were standing together beneath the glowing lights. But there was something else. Behind them, faintly visible in the soft lens flare, was that same shape from before a reflection, a shimmer, a figure almost too subtle to be real. But it was there, the boy's face, smiling. Steve sat down slowly, the photo trembling slightly in his hands. He whispered, "Okay, God, I see you." Then he placed the photo on his mirror, right beside a framed picture of his own late mother, two faces from two different stories, united by the same love that time couldn't touch. Later that week, during his morning show, Steve spoke about the encounter not by name, not in detail, but in spirit. "You know," he said, his tone soft, his voice carrying that familiar weight of truth. "Everybody's out here trying to find their purpose. But sometimes, your purpose ain't something you chase. It's something that finds you when your heart's open enough to see it." He paused, his hand resting over his chest. "That day on Family Feud, I met a family that reminded me what this all means. You don't measure a good life by how many times you laughed. You measure it by how many hearts you helped heal. And let me tell you something." His voice wavered slightly. That healing? It goes both ways. Across the country, people who'd seen the clip wrote in: veterans, widows, parents, kids. One message stood out. My daughter passed 2 years ago. I stopped watching TV after that. Then I saw your episode with that family. It felt like she was sitting right beside me again. Thank you for reminding me that the people we love never really leave us. Steve printed that message and taped it to the same mirror beside the photo. Every morning before going on stage, he looked at those words, then at the smiling faces beside them, and whispered a simple prayer. Let me make somebody feel seen today. Months later, the Collins family returned to the studio not for an episode but to visit. This time, there were no cameras, no applause, just hugs. Steve embraced each of them like old friends. "How y'all been holding up?" he asked, his smile warm, fatherly. Angela smiled back. "Good. We still watch your show every night. We laugh, we cry. It's part of our healing now." Steve nodded. "You know, I think about your boy every day. Every time I walk out there, I think about him. I make sure somebody in that audience laughs the way he did." Grace, now 17, reached into her purse and handed him a small wrapped box. "We made this for you," she said softly. Inside was a custom-made pocket watch, engraved with a single phrase on the inside lid: "Keep laughing, Matthew Collins, 2004-2019. Steve's voice cracked when he read it. "I don't even know what to say." Angela took his hand. "You already did, every time you smile." He held the watch tightly, the weight of it grounding him in that moment. "Well," he whispered, "I guess he really did change my life." That night, as he locked the studio and walked out into the cool Atlanta air, Steve looked up at the sky. The stars above shimmered against the dark, and somewhere in that quiet space between heaven and earth, he could almost hear it: laughter, light, the sound of a boy who never really left. Sometimes, television doesn't just entertain, it heals. If this story touched your heart, subscribe and share so the world never forgets moments like these. This is Stories Left Behind, where human stories are never lost.